In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese commanders entered battle with a set of firm assumptions about the enemy they would face. These beliefs were not casual opinions, but deeply ingrained doctrines shaped by decades of military tradition, racial ideology, and hard-won victories in China and Southeast Asia. American soldiers, according to pre-war Japanese military assessments, were expected to be physically large but mentally weak, dependent on material comfort, lacking discipline, and unwilling to endure sustained hardship. Japanese field manuals described Western troops as overly reliant on firepower and prone to collapse once casualties mounted. Many officers believed that U.S. Marines, though well-equipped, would falter under pressure, retreat when confronted with fanatical resistance, and crumble in the face of night attacks, starvation, and relentless close combat. These views were shared openly before the war, but what followed was something Japanese commanders did not anticipate and would rarely admit publicly. The first real shock came not from grand strategy, but from the battlefield itself. As Japanese units encountered U.S. Marines in prolonged combat on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and later across the Central Pacific, the gap between expectation and reality widened dangerously. Marines did not retreat as predicted. They absorbed punishment, regrouped, and attacked again. Even when isolated, low on ammunition, or surrounded, they held ground with a stubbornness that Japanese officers found deeply unsettling. In private letters and after-action notes, a different tone emerged. Commanders began to describe Marines not as soft or undisciplined, but as unyielding, mechanical in their persistence, and strangely fearless under sustained fire. One Japanese battalion commander wrote that American Marines did not charge recklessly, nor did they flee. They advanced methodically, as if loss itself did not change their intent. This behavior clashed directly with Japanese expectations of morale-based collapse, forcing officers to quietly reconsider everything they thought they knew about their enemy. As the war dragged on, these private reassessments became more detailed and more alarming. Japanese commanders noted that Marines adapted rapidly to terrain, learned from mistakes, and returned stronger after each failed assault. Where Imperial Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual superiority and decisive charges, Marines relied on coordination, communication, and relentless pressure. Japanese reports from island campaigns increasingly mentioned the psychological toll of facing an enemy who did not respond to intimidation or attrition in expected ways. Night attacks, once a cornerstone of Japanese battlefield dominance, lost much of their effectiveness against Marines who learned to anticipate infiltration, establish overlapping fields of fire, and remain disciplined even in darkness. In private diaries, officers admitted frustration and disbelief that American units continued to function coherently after days of continuous bombardment, something Japanese planners had assumed would shatter morale completely. Yet these realizations remained largely unspoken beyond trusted circles. Publicly, Japanese command emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and inevitable victory. Privately, however, a growing number of officers began recording a sobering truth. The U.S. Marines were not the fragile force they had expected. They were resilient, adaptive, and far more dangerous than doctrine had predicted. These private admissions marked the beginning of a quiet but profound shift in how Japanese commanders understood the war they were fighting, a shift that would only deepen as the Pacific campaigns grew bloodier and more desperate. As encounters with U.S. Marines multiplied across the Pacific, Japanese commanders began committing their real assessments to paper, but rarely in the reports meant for higher command or propaganda offices. Instead, the most revealing opinions appeared in personal diaries, unofficial field notes, and candid after-action reflections circulated quietly among officers. These documents tell a very different story from the public narrative of inevitable victory. In private, Japanese commanders increasingly acknowledged that Marines fought in ways that defied imperial doctrine. One recurring observation was their refusal to disengage, even after sustaining heavy losses. A regimental commander after Guadalcanal wrote that Marine units continued advancing despite casualties that would have broken most formations, noting with unease that American troops seemed trained to operate even when leadership was disrupted. Another officer recorded that killing Marine officers did not paralyze units as expected. Non-commissioned officers and even ordinary soldiers stepped in seamlessly, maintaining pressure without pause. For an army that placed immense emphasis on hierarchy and command presence, this adaptability was deeply troubling. Japanese field reports also reveal a growing respect for Marine coordination and discipline under fire. While Imperial units often relied on bold, decisive maneuvers meant to shock the enemy into collapse, Marines advanced deliberately, supported by precise artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. Japanese officers noted that Marine attacks felt less like waves and more like tightening pressure, each movement supported, rehearsed, and adjusted in real time. One battalion diary described Marine assaults as slow but unstoppable, adding that defenders were given no moment to recover or reorganize. Even more unsettling was the observation that Marines did not celebrate small victories or appear emotionally affected by success or loss. Japanese commanders interpreted this not as apathy, but as a sign of professional conditioning. Soldiers trained to view combat as a task rather than a test of spirit. In private, several officers admitted that this mindset made Marines far harder to intimidate than anticipated. The psychological impact of this realization was significant. Japanese doctrine had long emphasized breaking the enemy's will through surprise, fear, and relentless pressure, but Marines proved resistant to these methods. Night attacks, infiltration tactics, and sudden banzai charges produced fewer decisive results than expected. In diary entries, officers described Marines who remained alert through the night, maintained overlapping fields of fire, and responded to attacks with controlled violence rather than panic. One officer wrote bitterly that, "The Americans do not sleep like other soldiers, they wait." Another noted that Marine units quickly adapted to Japanese tactics, setting traps, adjusting patrol patterns, and preemptively targeting infiltration routes. This adaptability forced Japanese commanders into increasingly costly assaults, eroding manpower without achieving breakthroughs. Yet these frustrations were rarely communicated upward in full honesty. To admit that the enemy had learned faster and endured more would have been seen as weakness. Instead, the truth circulated quietly among those facing Marines directly. Officers warned one another in private conversations and marginal notes that Marines could not be counted on to retreat, that morale collapse was unlikely, and that prolonged engagements favored the Americans. These warnings rarely altered strategic planning, but they shaped the mindset of those on the ground. By the time of later campaigns, Japanese commanders no longer underestimated Marines, but by then it was too late. The enemy they had once dismissed had become the standard by which battlefield difficulty was measured. In private, many officers admitted a grim conclusion. Facing U.S. Marines meant fighting an opponent who would not yield, not because of fanaticism, but because yielding simply was not part of their training. By the midpoint of the Pacific War, the language used by Japanese commanders in their private writings began to shift in a way that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. The early confidence, rooted in assumptions of spiritual superiority and enemy fragility, gave way to something colder and more analytical. Defeats that could no longer be explained away as bad luck or temporary setbacks forced officers to confront a difficult reality. U.S. Marines were not just resilient, they were becoming more effective with each battle. In personal journals recovered after the war, Japanese commanders increasingly described Marines as predictably relentless, a phrase that appears in multiple independent accounts. Unlike opponents who relied on surprise or momentum, Marines applied constant pressure, adjusting their tactics incrementally but relentlessly. One senior officer noted that after initial landings, Marine units seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, as if combat itself sharpened their coordination. This observation deeply unsettled commanders trained to believe that sustained casualties inevitably degraded enemy effectiveness. What disturbed Japanese officers most was not Marine aggression, but Marine patience. In private after-action notes, commanders remarked that Marines rarely rushed into traps, even when opportunities appeared obvious. Where Japanese doctrine favored seizing initiative through decisive charges, Marines often paused, observed, and then dismantled defenses methodically. A Japanese colonel wrote that Marine units advanced like engineers rather than warriors, dismantling positions piece by piece until resistance collapsed. This clashed violently with imperial ideals of honor-driven combat, yet it proved devastatingly effective. Marines also demonstrated an ability to absorb failure without losing cohesion. When attacks stalled or positions were lost, Japanese commanders expected hesitation or disorder. Instead, Marines regrouped, altered their approach, and returned with overwhelming coordination. In one diary entry, an officer admitted that each failed American assault only made the next one more precise, a realization that undermined long-held beliefs about morale-based warfare. As these realizations accumulated, unease began to seep into private correspondence. Commanders wrote of an enemy who could not be exhausted psychologically, who treated attrition as an expected cost rather than a deterrent. Several officers noted that Marine units continued operating effectively even after suffering losses that Japanese doctrine considered catastrophic. This forced a re-evaluation of how the enemy measured success. Marines, it seemed, did not require immediate victory or symbolic triumphs. They were content to grind forward incrementally, confident that time favored them. Japanese commanders recognized this as a strategic threat far greater than raw firepower. One diary described Marines as an army that does not need belief to function, a striking admission from a military culture that placed supreme value on spirit and resolve. The implication was clear. Traditional methods of intimidation and sacrifice were failing against an opponent whose strength lay in organization and endurance. These private doubts rarely surfaced in official communications. Publicly, commanders continued to emphasize courage, sacrifice, and honor. But behind closed doors, many admitted that the psychological balance had shifted. Marines were no longer seen as merely dangerous, they were seen as inevitable. The growing awareness that Marine operations would continue regardless of losses eroded confidence at the command level, even if it never reached the front lines in explicit terms. Officers began preparing their men not for victory, but for survival against an enemy that would not be deterred. By this stage of the war, Japanese commanders no longer underestimated U.S. Marines. Instead, they quietly feared the implications of facing an opponent whose methods rendered traditional assumptions about morale, endurance, and collapse obsolete. The war had not just changed the battlefield. It had changed how commanders privately understood what it meant to fight and lose against the U.S. Marines. By the final year of the war, the private language of Japanese commanders had changed completely. The dismissive tone that once colored early assessments of U.S. Marines was gone, replaced by something far more restrained and far more revealing. In diaries and late-war memoranda written during battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese officers no longer described Marines as crude, reckless, or spiritually weak. Instead, they used words like systematic, unrelenting, and difficult to disrupt. One senior staff officer wrote that Marine units advance without haste, without anger, and without illusion, noting that this made them extraordinarily hard to defeat. Another commander observed that Marines did not appear motivated by hatred or fanaticism, but by a professional acceptance of violence as a task to be completed. This distinction mattered deeply. Japanese doctrine had long relied on the idea that willpower and sacrifice could overwhelm material strength. Facing an enemy that did not rely on emotional momentum, but on planning and repetition, exposed the limits of that belief. What troubled Japanese commanders most was how Marines behaved under conditions meant to break them. Late war reports describe Marine units continuing operations despite exhaustion, heavy casualties, and terrain that made movement nearly impossible. Officers wrote with frustration about attacks that resumed with mechanical regularity, even after defenders believed they had inflicted decisive losses. One diary entry from the Okinawa campaign noted that Marines returned again at dawn, not angry, not triumphant, simply determined, adding that this consistency drained defenders faster than fear ever could. Several commanders remarked that Marines treated night attacks not as moments of chaos, but as predictable events to be managed. Defensive positions were reinforced, listening posts rotated, and countermeasures adjusted with each encounter. Japanese officers, trained to see the night as a domain of psychological dominance, now found that advantage steadily eroding. In private, they admitted that Marines had learned how to fight their war and had done so faster than expected. Alongside frustration, a reluctant respect began to surface. Some commanders wrote that Marines fought without theatrical gestures, focusing entirely on objectives rather than symbolic acts. This stood in stark contrast to Japanese expectations of honorable combat defined by visible courage and sacrifice. One officer remarked that Marines showed bravery not through dramatic charges, but through the refusal to stop advancing. Another noted that Marine leadership encouraged initiative at lower levels, allowing units to continue functioning even when communications were disrupted. This adaptability impressed Japanese officers who were accustomed to rigid command structures. In one post-war interview, a former regimental commander admitted that Marine units felt endless, not because of their numbers, but because losses did not visibly alter their behavior. The enemy did not appear shaken, only recalibrated. Yet this respect remained almost entirely private. To acknowledge admiration for the enemy openly would have undermined morale and contradicted official narratives of honor and inevitability. Instead, these assessments stayed confined to diaries, marginal notes, and quiet conversations among officers who understood the reality they faced. By this stage of the war, Japanese commanders no longer believed that Marines could be intimidated, exhausted, or shocked into collapse. They had come to see them as an enemy defined by endurance rather than spirit, by method rather than emotion. This realization did not change the outcome of the battles, but it changed how those battles were experienced by those on the losing side. In private, many commanders acknowledged that they were no longer fighting an opponent they could break psychologically. They were fighting one they could only delay. When the war ended and the guns finally fell silent, Japanese commanders were confronted with a reality they could no longer soften or hide behind doctrine. In captivity, in post-war interrogations, and in memoirs written years later, many officers spoke with a candor that would have been impossible during the conflict itself. Freed from the need to sustain morale or preserve imperial narratives, they reflected openly on what they had learned about U.S. Marines, and their conclusions were strikingly consistent. Again and again, former commanders emphasized that Marines were not defeated by fear, deprivation, or shock. One general remarked that American Marines did not require belief in victory to function, explaining that they continued to operate effectively even when success was distant or abstract. This, he admitted, had fundamentally undermined Japanese assumptions about how wars were won. Marines fought not for symbolic triumphs, but to complete objectives, and would continue doing so regardless of cost. Several post-war accounts noted that Marines possessed a form of psychological endurance Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. Where imperial doctrine assumed that sustained pressure would erode morale, Marines appeared conditioned to expect hardship as a baseline. One former division commander stated bluntly that American Marines were prepared to suffer without interpreting suffering as failure. This distinction, he argued, made them uniquely dangerous. Casualties did not signal collapse. They were absorbed, reorganized around, and compensated for through methodical planning. Another officer reflected that Marine units behaved like mechanisms rather than formations driven by emotion, a comment not meant as insult, but as an acknowledgement of their consistency. In retrospect, many Japanese commanders recognized that they had mistaken material dependence for weakness, failing to see that logistics, training, and coordination formed a kind of resilience that spiritual doctrine alone could not match. Perhaps the most revealing admissions concerned respect, a word rarely used during the war, but increasingly present afterward. Several commanders acknowledged that Marines fought with a discipline that made them predictable in the best possible way. Once engaged, they would not disengage without cause. This reliability forced Japanese defenders into prolonged, exhausting resistance rather than decisive engagements. One officer admitted that by late war, facing Marines felt like standing in the path of a slow-moving machine, adding that you could damage it, but you could not frighten it away. Others spoke of the frustration of night operations that no longer produced panic, of infiltration attempts that were detected and neutralized, and of defenders who realized too late that intimidation had lost its power. These reflections were often accompanied by regret, not just for defeat, but for the initial arrogance that had shaped early decisions and cost thousands of lives. In the end, what Japanese commanders privately said about U.S. Marines reveals more than battlefield assessments. It exposes a clash between two fundamentally different military philosophies. One relied on morale collapse, symbolic courage, and decisive shock. The other relied on preparation, adaptation, and endurance. When those philosophies met, Japanese commanders were forced, slowly, quietly, and painfully, to acknowledge which one prevailed. They never said it publicly during the war, but in diaries, in confessions, and in post-war reflections, the conclusion was unmistakable. U.S. Marines were not the enemy they had expected, and that misjudgment changed everything.